Hello and welcome to our latest podcast on the cost of living. But increasingly, what we wanted to do is change this away from just the cost of living podcast. And that's why we've invited Mark along today to join me and Hannah. We want to talk about our latest survey, which is effectively trying to look at the sort of ever-changing state of the nation that we live in. And that's going to be the tone as we move forward through these podcasts. And sadly, cost of living issues seem to be here to stay for quite a long time, but there are so many other trends going on. So Mark, can you tell us a little bit about the surveys that you're involved in and what you think you're going to cover today?
Thanks, Paul. Hi, Hannah. We've been doing surveys dating back to essentially when COVID started changing consumer behaviour, so that we could get under the skin of what was fueling and motivating certain changes in what people were doing and where they were moving and how they were spending. And it really helps us to augment the other data sets that we hold here at CACI and to explore, as I say, more of the why. We've got a wealth of intelligence on how people spend, where they spend, and how that's been changing over time. This allows us to get into the details of what is fueling and motivating the changes in that consumer behaviour. And with many surveys, it allows you to get into things around demographic characteristics, such as where people live in the UK, the age groups, the genders of the respondents. But crucially, we're able to enrich our survey results with ACORN, which gives us some really powerful insights across the affluent spectrum. So as James was explaining on the previous podcast, we've now moved into a new iteration of ACORN. And as we see here, we've got 6 high-level categories, or high-level segments in the ACORN hierarchy. Now, ACORN allows us to explore demographic segments at a more granular level, but of course, when we do that, the number of respondents in each of those groups gets watered down. So for the purposes of looking at this survey, we're really going to remain largely at the top level with these 6 demographic categories. And the outlier responses tend to come at either extreme, where people are either most affluent or least affluent ends of the spectrum. So I'll probably end up talking a lot more about, say, low-income living and stretched society at the bottom end of that affluent spectrum, and slightly more about the luxury lifestyles and established affluence at the top end of the affluent spectrum, where those in the middle categories, thriving neighbourhoods and steadfast communities, tend to be slightly more representative of the overall. And now we've been doing these surveys on a quarterly basis for a couple of years now. We are using every time a nationally representative sample of the UK, and each time we're digging into 2,000 unique individual respondents.
Yeah, so where should we start? So cost of living is the background of this. Do you want to start with some cost of living findings?
Yeah, so I mean, the things that really stood out to us, we're looking at how people's housing situations are starting to impact their cost of living situations, changing how we're spending, the threat of missed payments on things like utility bills, council tax are really coming in here. Energy usage is always looming in the background, and I think that's going to really ramp up as a topic in the coming months. And then there are some really interesting insights around food bank usage that are really affecting the cost of living at the moment as well.
So, Mark, what have you found in relation to some of those housing questions that you kind of asked consumers? Because I think there's been a lot of talk, especially in the media, about kind of the unaffordability of renting as well as mortgages, and kind of what implications that has on people's lifestyles and where they can even live. So have you found anything interesting there by way of people's sentiment, or what they're worried is going to happen to them?
So we found some concern right across the housing spectrum, and the reasons for that concern differ according to your housing situation. So we already look at disaggregating some of our data by whether people are homeowners, whether they are mortgaged homeowners, if they're renting, what sort of housing situation they have, whether or not they're renting from local authorities or in the private sector. And we see that these concerns differ according to what your scenario is. It's unsurprising, really, that the threat of high interest rates is really affecting homeowners at the moment, but also those hoping to get onto the ladder. We saw nearly 60% of mortgaged homeowners say that they're concerned about interest rates staying high at the moment. And When you go towards the higher end of the affluent spectrum, people are then flagging concerns over the reduced value of their property portfolios. That as you change around on that affluent spectrum, so your concerns tend to sort of move with sort of the luxuries that those sorts of things can bring. But at the lower end, among younger homeowners, it relates more to the risk of negative equity. If you imagine only 2 years ago, first-time buyers might have been squeezing onto the housing ladder for the first time, incentivized by those stamp duty holidays, where they could get on with maybe just a 10% deposit and a 2-year fixed term on their mortgage. Now they might be fearing moving back into the rental sector because they've come from a very low rate for the time, fixed term mortgage, where they were really just pushing the limits of what you could do to get onto the housing ladder, encouraged by and incentivized by the government at the time. And now I think that's the evidence coming out of the survey is that there's a risk that they could be moving into that rental sector once again. And renters themselves are more concerned about being priced out of their current situation, where that means they're having to switch to another property within their area, or in some cases outside of the local area entirely.
So I've read from a couple of different places now that house prices have probably peaked for now, and they're going to start coming down to differing levels across the country. Is there a world in which that, well, at least from a consumer point of view anyway, they believe that actually that could be a helpful one, particularly young people that are trying to get on the housing ladder? The fact that average house price is going to drop slightly will help them.
Yeah, from the survey results, at least, that's not enough of a change that's enabling that movement onto the housing ladder. We saw around 1 in 3 private renters saying that they're concerned that they're not going to be able to get onto the housing ladder when they'd hoped. Nearly half of them expecting to be priced out of where they are. So, if anything, those private renters are fearing moving further away from those aspirations and closer to them.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a sobering thought. So, as you said at the beginning, you've been tracking these similar questions for quite a long time now. So, what are you seeing more generally on how people are spending and how that's changed over time, then, Mark?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that we asked that really help us to understand this. One is around how people are concerned for their personal finances, and then the other is what they think the impact will be on the changing cost of living upon them or their households in the near future. So if we think about that question about personal finances, the current rate of people saying that they are worried for their personal finances, and just them in the population, is 54%. That's been pretty stable actually over the last year, although it's been climbing slightly. It's always been just over 50%, but it's now at 54, which is the highest we've been tracking. The range does move along that affluent spectrum, so it's around 50% if you're more affluent, and the least affluent are reporting a rate of about 60% at the moment. We also see differences based upon generation, so it's higher among Gen X and millennials than it is among, say, baby boomers or Gen Z, because they have more financial pressures upon them. Well, it's worth noting that the rates for Gen Z have been rising for the last year. They were around 30% a year ago. That's risen to about 45% today among Gen Z, who are saying that they're worried for their personal finances. And that's what's then having this knock-on impact onto what people are describing about the impacts for them and their households in the coming months.
Why do you think it's grown? I mean, I guess, first of all, why it was assumedly lower because of that point you just made about the financial pressure, but why do you think it's grown so much? Because that's quite stark, that difference.
And I think that a large part of it is down to the sort of the prolonged period of the cost of living. For a long time, the younger groups have been able to get by perhaps with more support, which has been dwindling over time. And as those pressures rise from all these different angles that are contributing to the rising cost of living, so more individuals are being impacted, and those that had other avenues for support have just gradually seen them dwindling. And so the buffer that might have existed for Gen Z has just been eroded, and it's just been cranking up that concern around their personal finances as time's passed, and particularly, I suppose, over that time as interest rates have risen. So the availability of lower credit has been dropping, and perhaps people have been switched on more to saving.
Okay. And what about on the second of those two stats that you talked about there?
Yeah, so in the main, the expectations around the cost of living impacts are lower today than they were a year ago, although a lot of those concerns were fueled 12 months ago by fears around the rising cost of living due to the war in Ukraine. The primary impact that we see among those we ask about remains the use of energy, although that has been falling generally in the last year. Particularly, I suppose it's a seasonal effect, but among low-income living, that has been quite static. So we see all these other demographic groups reporting lower concerns around sort of the impacts of the rising cost of living on their energy use, but low-income living, that lowest affluent group on the ACORN spectrum, have been reporting consistent levels of concern around energy use. It's around 57% of respondents in that group believe they'll be using less energy in the coming months as a result of the rising cost of living. Whereas that result for the more affluent types has been falling gradually over the course of time. I think it's also worth keeping an eye on missed utility payments. So a year ago, around 12% of that lower income living category said that they thought they'd be missing payments in the coming months. In the latest survey, when we were asking people in September this year, that's risen to 19%, whereas it's around 9% for the rest of the UK population. And if
1
you
in
tie
5
that in,
people think
right,
they're going to be missing a payment. It's quite high.
Yeah, I mean, if you tie that with expectations around missing council tax and rent, then these sort of concerns begin to snowball. So while UK-wide we see these totals are relatively small, as you said, it's somewhere between 10 and 20% across the overall population, we see much greater differences across the affluent spectrum compared with other impacts people are expecting. If you look at cutting down your costs on certain areas or not being able to attend certain events, these are sorts of things that are sort of uniformly affecting people across the affluent spectrum. But when you look at how people are worried about missing rent payments, hitting council tax, and as we said, payments on utilities, they really skew on the affluent spectrum. And that's really going to lead to people going into arrears and the knock-on consequences that are going to come of that.
And I know you've also got some stuff around food bank usage, which is probably, it's a crutch there to support a lot of those people who are having to make those terrible decisions of, yeah, do I miss a meal or do I miss a payment? You've shown some quite stark figures in that as well. Yeah,
the use of food banks is, again, something we've been tracking every quarter for more than a year now. And we're at the point where 9% of respondents have said that that had used a food bank in the last year, and that's the highest level since we've been tracking this question. So that's the 9% of the UK population overall, not just of the of particular pockets of the population. In fact, that rises when people have children under 18 in the household. We saw that number go to 13% if there are where there's presence of children in the house, and it goes even higher to 22% among that low income living demographic where there are children present within the household. So when you get to that lowest income group, adding children into the house increases the incidence of food bank use by 50%. And then if we look further forward, we ask whether in the next 12 months people are expecting or considering using a food bank. And this number is also on the rise, and it's higher than it's been at any time during 2023 so far. And when we cut that by the generation of respondent, millennials are reporting the highest levels of usage, again tied back to what we were saying earlier about having more financial pressures and more concerns. They're probably more likely to have children, more likely to have a mortgage, and all of these things begin to compound. And when we combine those sort of generational views with the affluence views, we find that it rises to around 20% of that low income living group, where they are millennials and Gen X are considering using a food bank in the next 12 months, which is really concerning. And if from the reported numbers of use in the last 12 months are rising, those numbers are only going to increase if those fears are met.
Okay, so one thing we haven't talked about yet, but is a topic that a lot of our clients are interested in, is that discretionary spend piece. And We've been tracking it again for a while, as we know. But have you seen anything interesting by way of how people are, I guess, changing that type of spend?
Yeah, we really have. We tried to get into the nuances of it in the latest survey by asking how people's expenditure in certain areas has changed this year compared with last, and almost uniformly across the board, we've seen people saying they've reduced their expenditure. The only real outlier comes in grocery, where people have really maintained their expenditure compared with the previous year, largely because they don't really have much choice. We only saw 31% of people say that they've had to reduce their grocery spend year on year. But when you look at some other aspects of expenditure, particularly the more discretionary areas, those numbers really ramp up. It doubles when you go from, say, grocery spend to something like takeaways. So people saying they've reduced their expenditure on takeaways, nearly 2/3 of respondents said that they have reduced in that area. And then it cascades down when you look at things like going to pubs and bars, and leisure activities, cafes and restaurants. But even all these things that are looking into spend on home furnishings, entertainment and tech, on even clothing and footwear, people have, more than half of respondents said that they've cut their expenditure in all of those areas. And that's true among every demographic group, interestingly, with one exception, which is Gen Z. Gen Z, I know we talked about this really early on when we were looking at changing expenditure. Gen Z were the ones who were determined to hold on to their expenditure in these areas, and they continue to be so. They almost uniformly saying that they're sort of 1 in 3 of them are cutting their spend on all of those areas that we talked about, whereas it's more than 50%, 60% across these other demographic groups.
Yeah, indicating some kind of almost trickle-down effect, which eventually might change their expenditure, but for now they're kind of holding on with dear life.
It is, and well, we saw only this week that people are using cash more from articles in the news, and we are been asking people questions about that too. I think people are certainly a lot more conscious about how they're spending, where they're spending, what they're spending on, and tracking their spend using smarter ways to budget. And perhaps that's reflected in how Gen Z have been able to sort of avoid reducing their expenditure, because they've been perhaps more savvy up until last year already. And so they've not needed to reduce their expenditure quite so drastically, because they've been on top of it a bit more effectively up until that point.
If we talk specifically about fashion for a moment, we have seen, as a part of a lot of our other data sets, that there has been some kind of change in terms of how people are spending there, people trying to reduce. How are people making those changes? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so one of those areas or aspects of expenditure we've been asking around is around clothing and footwear. 51% of the overall level said they've reduced their expenditure on clothing and footwear, and the ways that people have been doing that has really varied. We saw when people said that they've reduced their expenditure on clothing, we tried to get under the skin of why, and more than 1/3 of people said that they're just making do with their existing wardrobe. Other groups of the respondents to the survey have been using more innovative methods of getting by. So we've seen a lot of people saying they're using the second-hand clothing market more often. Around 1 in 5 of our respondents say that that's how they've been able to reduce their expenditure. And others have been saying, around 1 in 10, they've been buying the same quantity of clothing and footwear, but they've been going to cheap alternatives for it. So they've been going sort of down the high street sort of ladder, as it were, in order to find other ways of getting by.
And another topic that I know that we're quite interested in, so F&B spend has obviously been impacted by the cost of living crisis, but not to the level that people first expected. It's been a more resilient category than I think people thought it was going to be. Why are people continuing to spend on this sector, given that it's considered discretionary in comparison to some of those other categories?
Yeah, and from the questions we've been asking, again, we tried to dig under the surface of this to understand why some of that F&B spend has been maintained. For some people, it's because disposable income has increased, and for others, it's they've had to give up on other things in order to continue to go to restaurants or the pub, for example. But a lot of it actually tracks back to sort of this hangover from lockdowns and from COVID. We saw a lot of people saying they're still catching up with people post lockdowns, and as many as 15% of people say they find it still really important to socialize in order to maintain their mental health. And so maintaining that spend in those areas has been a necessary evil in order to address another area of concern that I know we're going to come on to when we talk about the changing state of the nation.
Okay, thank you so much. And conscious that, of the length of the podcast, because we just got such a wealth of information in this latest survey, what we're going to do is we're going to end there. And what we're going to do is we're going to run a twin podcast with this one that will look into some of the wider state of the nation things that we're finding. So hopefully you can tune into that one. Otherwise, we look forward to catching up with you next month. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Cheers, Paul.